Good to see you this morning. I kind of waffled back and forth on this class being after worship. I look for the class and the interaction with the people to charge me up before I get in the pulpit. And so we hardly sing a couple songs and then I'm jumping up there. And I pray extra hard for that. And then afterwards, I just want to keep hanging around and talking. We got to stop and do class. But I do like class. And there seems to be a larger group in here. So send in your feelings and your thoughts on that. I can go about it either way. So it's not a big issue to me. But we hear a lot of different things. So last week, we began a new approach, I guess I'll say, or at least a different approach, I'm not sure how new it is, to a study of the Ten Commandments. But from a perspective of it answering our character crisis in the United States world today, but at least we can say we own this little segment of Chattanooga, and it has its own crisis also. So that's what we are doing. We discussed whether or not there was a crisis, very minor, because there's not a lot of discussion. I think we all pretty much agreed on that, other to the extent of it, which it seems to be rather impactful. And because of that, I see the tremendous impact it can have on the church, on us as individuals. All of us, to the oldest in this group, have really grown up in an era where we've seen that crisis beginning and getting worse. So no matter what age you happen to be at, I think you can say it's been ingrained within you almost all your life, if not your entire life. Because of the impact of that creeping into our lives so gently, so quietly, from grade school on up, and helped to be reinforced by television and everything else that surrounds us and the people we interact with, it can't help but have some kind of impact on us. Unless you are living like some of these monks that I saw, at least I didn't see the monks, I saw the remnants of their work when I got a chance to go to Greece a couple weeks ago. And back in the 3rd and 4th century, they actually carved out caves or used caves that were formed by God in the sides of these mountains. Don't think of them as trees, just think of it as a rock that's slick, stuck on the ground, but it's like almost a mile high. And I don't know how they scale those things to get into those caves, but they did that so they could live by themselves. But that's not you and me. And we interact with people, and I think that is the way God really wants it, for that much. Man, it's not good for man to be alone, God said in the Garden of Eden, or about the Garden of Eden. So here we are interacting, and as a consequence of that, we are strengthened and reinforced and built when we are with a lot of good people. But when a good majority of the people start behaving a different way, sorry for my throat congestion here, you can't help because of this, it has some kind of impact on you. And you start feeling a little bit more toward their way, especially if you've grown up like that, because you've not seen the alternate. It's never been there as a comparison. And so that's where we're at. And we talked a little bit about absolutes last week, and the fact that right can always be right and wrong can always be wrong. And there isn't this interaction or change. I don't want to go back and re-discuss all that, but just to mention it, and the fact that it's hard to hold a confidence that this is a book of absolutes, when more and more people keep calling it an antique book that's not relevant, that probably wasn't even relevant in the day that it was given to whoever it was given, and they would argue the basis of that. And so how could it be relevant today? And how could it be absolute? I recall a discussion I had. This was in Oak Ridge, and comparison of his looks, if you've ever seen that Einstein picture with the hair in all directions, most of you have, that was Ed. And his wife was a member of the church, and he would come with her. And he wore what I used to wear when I would go out on a date when I was 18, except the inside-out sweatshirt that he wore would have holes in it. And he was, I think, a PhD in molecular, biological, whatever, science in one of the Oak Ridge plants. Super intellect, very down to earth. And I would discuss with him about truth, always being true. He said, how can you know that it's always true and that you're absolutely sure it's right? Because we're learning today about things that was said 2 years or 10 years ago about science, and they said, this is the way it is. And all of a sudden we're finding that it's not. And that factor that what we learn today nullifies all of that. So how do you know, since you don't know everything, that those things really are true? Because you might discover something that negates all of that you were learning along the way. And how would you answer somebody like that? We'll talk about it today. That first command seems to bear a foundational support to the absoluteness of truth. So that's kind of where we are. So back to Exodus 20. 10 Commandments. It's not the only time that the 10 Commandments are given. It's just the first time. Sorry for the throat again. That's the last time I'll apologize. So verses 1 through 3. And God spoke all these words, saying. So as we're starting, I'm picking it apart here on purpose. God is speaking, and I guess Moses is chiseling away. This is what God says. I want you to write these things down. And as we mentioned last week, they're written, not just oral. So when you pass it on to somebody else, it still says the same thing it has said last year and the year before, and there's no confusion about it. God spoke all these words, saying, thank you. Pure water. No, okay. Yeah, not out of the tap. No, our tap's terrible. The pipes in this building are as old as the building. And the water still flows through those same old pipes. Good. Okay. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Commandment 1. No other gods. It has been mentioned even recently here from somebody, I don't remember it was in Bible class or what, that it's so amazing that before Moses came down from the mountain carrying those stones, that they already broken command number 1 down at the bottom of the mountain. And they had a golden calf, and they're ready for that piece of iron to lead them out of whatever they thought was going to lead them. And we think our world is crazy. And yet we kind of go the same route. We just honor other things and we think it's going to help us better than what God does. And that's where they're at. No other gods. You notice in here, God doesn't make any defense for his existence. Kind of interesting. What do you make of that? Now, I just want you to remember command number 1, I exist, I am real. Why is that not a fundamental thing? Sometimes we think it is. Is God real? Sure. Do you ever have to prove to somebody, or have you ever discussed with someone, God is real, he exists? I have. Sure you have. Why is that not the starting place? Why don't we start with God exists, and then from there move to the next? Right.
Who do I say that you are? And God says that I am subject verb.
Mm-hmm.
I am who I am.
I am.
Not Alex. Alex exists is essentially.
Mm-hmm.
God said, I exist. I am. His very name means he exists.
Out of that, you could also argue the point that for these people, as they're at the bottom of this mountain, and they were fearful when he went up to even getting near the mountain. And at the top of the mountain was lightning and thunder and clouds and smoke and all this. They didn't even want to touch the mountain, which was one of the commands they weren't supposed to do. You didn't have to prove to them that God exists. Their concern was, don't get God mad. And that's pretty much where the pagan world comes from, by the way. You worry over making all the pagan gods happy. And when the flood gods come in, it's because you haven't done something right. And God is not approaching it from that angle. But he automatically knows they better know this. I mean, it's just too obvious. And we may come down to the Romans 1 passage again a little later at the end. I tried to get there last week and didn't make it at the end of class. But this whole idea. Okay, so who is God and what is he doing in these first couple verses here that tells you, I have the authority to command you? Yeah. I am your God who's done this for you. You wouldn't be where you are if it wasn't for me. Funny how quickly people forget what God has done for them and what we've gained in life. As I said at the beginning of services, because it hit me, I guess, last week or the week before, that how easy it is for us to get right back into that groove of, we've always sat here and worshiped, but there was a period of time where we didn't. And it was so crazy, but it felt so good to get back together. And we would talk about how we took for granted that fellowship that we shared. How easy it is to take for granted that God exists and what he's done for us and how he's blessed us. So God comes back and he says, I want you to know, don't forget this. Point number 1, this is where I've been at. This is where you've been at, and you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for me. So therefore, no other gods. And there's in that the authority that he has and the power that he has as he's talking about this. Again, they are forgetful people, but we can go back and share with them the history of what went on. How did they get there? It was only by God's power. And God picked Moses to help in this process Didn't have to have him. Could have done it on his own. Did God need 10 plagues? 10 plagues, 10 commands. That's kind of strange. But did he need 10? No. He didn't need any plagues. He didn't need Moses. But he took them through this process, I think, all along the way to help them to see his power and his authority. I never had a chance to go back and check the validity of some statement that someone made to me, but that in Egypt, that there were certain gods that they worshiped that related to every one of those plagues that came upon the Egyptians. And God was using every one of those things to show, I've got power over this God, this God, this God. Anyone you want to name, I'm over that. And made sense. And obviously, they did have a multiplicity of gods. And God would always show himself greater than anyone. I could bring the plague in, and I could take it out. I can be in charge of night and dark, if you like. I can do anything I want. So he's establishing authority and power. Interestingly, that the Greek word, when you move to the New Testament, which is written in Greek, the Greek word in the New Testament, the old language, what I'm going to say, is exousia. And when you look in the New Testament and you're reading that word and it's translated, sometimes, depending on your translation, it'll say power and sometimes authority. So they come to Jesus after he'd turned the temple upside down. John chapter 3, I believe it was, or 2. That was the first time. Then afterwards, after his triumphal entry in, he did it again. But he went into the temple and he's turned all the tables over and ran off the animals and all this. And they came up to him with this question, who gave you the power, and sometimes it says authority, to do that? The exousia. Who gave you that? Where do you get this great power, is basically it. And although we're looking at the Hebrew, because it's Old Testament, God is revealing that concept. I've got all power and all authority. Is that mentioned somewhere else in the New Testament that Jesus said? All authority has been given unto me in heaven and earth. When he says the apostles. So as we're looking at this whole thing, he is demonstrating that he has. Now, as he's talking about it, though, he talks about what he's done for them. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. They had been there, what, 10, 15 years as slaves? How long was it? I'm joking now, but come on. Hundreds, 400 years. So anybody who'd been in Egypt, except for the little infants, they'd been there the whole life. And so on their way out, they're seeing that drastic change. And all of this is demonstrated that God is a God that blesses and takes care of and watches over and directs. Why should he not have all power and authority? It just makes sense. I'm not sure who are the engineers for Fisher Body, for instance, that puts together the Chevrolet products and the motors and stuff. I did almost a 2-week stint right out of high school in working in a factory at Fisher Body, and we put together Chevrolets. But somewhere in that office area were some guys that knew exactly how to make that motor run and how to connect it with all of the supplies that it needed to have to make the thing operate. And they knew better than anybody else how to get it back into shape if something was not working. And the point I'm getting out of this is that God is saying, I've put this whole thing together. I've shaped this, I've built this, I've blessed, I've taken care of. Out of everything else, I know how to take care of you better than you could ever do yourselves. So why should we even want to have anybody else in charge? I mean, who would you trust? Why would you even want to do it? And when my car breaks, I go to somebody that knows a lot more than I know. Please fix it. It's doing this. I can actually describe the noise it's making. But that's about as good as I get. Some people go in and say, there's something wrong, fix it. At least I can define it a little bit better than that. But I still have no idea. And they smile at me when I say, it could be this or it could be this. And they go, we'll check it out. That's okay. Way back, I used to put spark plugs in my old car. That's pretty much the extent. But here's God who's capable of putting this whole thing together, and he's the God that blesses. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. So why do we even need a command? Don't ever put another God in there. Well, of course not. And yet he puts it in there. And here's the question, why? What is there in man that makes us strive after changing that? Choice. We have a choice. God has made us as human beings to choose. So we can choose differently. And along that path, we don't choose the right thing. And why is it? How is it that we get off track? Ego? Influences? Tie anything else in there? Laziness? Stupid decision, the devil? Notice Barbara mentioned the devil here, but now it's all gone. Lack of knowledge? Lack of caring? Get depressed? Everything that's going on in your hearts and your lives right now that kind of holds you back from listening, from really getting too close, all that stuff that surrounds us, how we're raised, the environment we're taken in, anything that Satan, as Barbara was mentioning, can put out there that could cause you to just question and put just a spark of doubt in there. And anybody can have doubt. Our most faithful Christians, our most fervent older women or men, the people that teach the classes, the preachers that preach the lessons. It's interesting, as you well know, you're old enough to have seen this, somebody that walks away from everything, not just stops going to church once in a while, but just quits. And you talk to them just a little bit and you go, I've just lost it. I don't know if I believe anymore. Believe what? Anything. I mean, God exists? Yeah, he's there, but I just don't know how it connects to me. And they can sit down and feel, I'm not sure how to describe it, this lack of connection. And it can happen. Or they can get so angry and so upset, or can go off in the world because of sins that are very enticing, and there are abundance of those, and just any number of different things that can keep that. But God is a God who blesses. Ego, Tom mentioned. I will build how I want to build. And for some reason, by the mixture of all these different things, our mind starts questioning, why can't I decide? I wanted to decide today or for this moment. Does that make sense? Been there? Are there? In and out of that? Yeah. And so I like to just decide for myself. And I keep saying how it's just so amazing that we keep going back to that very first sin, and it always seems to point toward another angle that Satan's after. I will decide myself. This looks good. I want to taste this. I'm just going to do this one time. Just this one moment, one bite, that's all. And so they do. All right. So get down to command number 1. You shall have no other gods before me. There was a Pharisee or a lawyer, I think, who came to Jesus. And he wanted to know what the greatest commands were. And Jesus said, you know them. What are they? So the guy, love the Lord God with all your heart. And he threw in there, and the neighbor is yourself. Jesus says, good. Do that and you've got it right. And then Luke says, and seeking to justify himself, he asked the question, who's my neighbor? He didn't want to do that one. And he didn't want to argue with Jesus about it because he knew he'd lose. So I'm just going to cloud this. You know, who knows? How can you really know truth? And so he goes into a debate over loving somebody else and doesn't debate loving God, the first command, which I always found interesting. Because he's not going to win that one with Jesus, and probably other people are listening in, and so you know you better love God. So let's just talk about the thing that frustrates all of us, that guy that lives next door, or that person I have to live with, or the guy that sits on the pew next to me, or any number of things, all these different neighbors. Alex looking over. No, don't do that, Alex. He's already got a red face. He's guilty. But God starts with number 1. No other gods before me. He didn't start with what we would have thought would have been, okay, let's work this relationship thing out because it's going to be a big thing with you and how you're supposed to treat one another. He starts with no other gods before me. Now, why would that be the basis for everything?
David, I'm wondering, why isn't it said lawyer could say, okay, well, you know, I haven't put another God before you, but
Yeah.
that's not everything in my life. I have other things in my life.
Right.
And compartmentalize it that way, where other things could actually come before quote unquote God.
Uh-huh.
And I wonder why it wasn't said more explicit. You shall have nothing else before me.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to
No,
take you off subject, but
no, it is. It's on subject. No other gods. He didn't say anything else. All the other little things that come along, like a car or a job or retirement or wanting to grow your family or anything. But he says gods. But think about how many gods they have, because we're always one God. And maybe there's another one over here, but everything was gods to them. And some of the Greek philosophers thought there were gods in everything. And so that small g gods could be absolutely anything and everything out there. Just the whole menagerie. The word that Paul uses when he's talking in Colossians chapter 2 talks about all the Godheads together, all the different gods, and it is a Greek word called pleroma. And it's everything that every Greek person could ever imagine as being a god. So there's earth, and there's fire, and there's wind, and it's everything out there. The Japanese, Caleb was telling me that they have this really strong sense of balance in their life. And everything has to be done just right, because it's like you're walking a tightrope. He didn't use that phrase, but I visualize it like that. And you want everybody to be happy. You don't want to do anything wrong. You don't even cross the street until you get down to the corner to cross it. Even because I asked Caleb, his little apartment was like right across the street from where the building was that we were staying with I forget what it's called. But to get there, we had to go down to the corner to the stoplight, wait for the stoplight to turn the right color, and then cross, and then come back. And it's like it was late at night. We just got set through saying goodbye, and it's like, there is nobody around here. I said, can we not cross? No, don't do that. And he said, somebody might see me. But I really think he adapted so much to that philosophy, he didn't want to cross. He thought something would go wrong in his life with somebody else out there if he didn't do the zigzag. And I so much wanted to just get out on the road and do this. But I was afraid it would unbalance his life the rest of the time I was there. But it's all of those things were God's. Everything. I guess the stoplights maybe, but you see that, and this is where a lot of the world is. And we don't conceive of that because we grow up in pretty much a monotheistic society. There's one God. We've always known that. And to look at somebody else that will bow down before a rock, you go, where do they get that idea? And yet I've seen so many different places and watched, not just in India, but in so many places, and everything's a God. So I guess to answer that question, it's like, if you pull out a dollar bill, that's a God to them. It's the money God, and there's the car God, and anything that makes anything run and tick for you, including the thing that runs and ticks, are all gods. So that's the small g God. And whatever you put in front of, or make number one, that becomes your God. Who sits on the throne in your life is the concept of what we're looking at here. But back to what we're talking about, character crisis. That at the basis of making God number one, it is the basis, basically, of where our character will be built. That when God is number one, then everything can have a construction on it. It is the foundation for who we are. And when we start having the small gods and all these other things, then there's competition. And there's only space for one God anyway. The Greek culture just balances or looks at it so differently. So marriage relationships, reputation, and all of those things that we look at as valuable become subject to God. Because He's the one who has the authority, who's blessed you, who takes care of you, who watches over you. And our life will be out of balance if we miss that. Because Jesus says, you're building on sand if you're not doing it on the rock. Which in that case was the Word, of course, when He's talking in Matthew. Observations, thoughts, anything, as we're looking at this character crisis.
So David, this is so, that first command is so foundational.
Yes.
And it's somewhat akin to, that's rule number one. And if you're in doubt, see rule number one.
Really true.
So, boy, he said it, he really set it up correctly. He laid that stake in the ground.
It's almost like he knows what he's doing there. Good.
It's so easy though, that we have things that we like, we enjoy, we put emphasis on. So easy to quote house another God. Something else that drives our life.
You mentioned a word, emphasis on, or a couple words, put emphasis on. It's not a, what's the word I'm looking at, concept? It's not a absolute decision. I am now going to do this. I'm going to move God off the throne, and I'm now today going to choose this. We just kind of lean that way. Just put a little
Unconscious decision.
emphasis. Today I'm going to I'm going to live this way or choose this, or
But you know what, though? When things don't go our way, who do we look at?
we don't look in the mirror, do we?
We do not.
How many times you've seen this going on, and people in their lives are actually visually, why me?
We want to control it till it don't go our way.
Yeah. And God's only letting us be fooled because we make those choices. But it's all choices. It absolutely is. So the whole character style that we have needs to be built on God being number one. Now you see why society's so opposed to talking about even the word command. The word command in itself, 10 commandments, it's like, whoa, that's harsh. Who are you to command me? It's like, am I a robot? No, you're not. I'm going to command you even though you're not. And so it's that that's a terrible way to look at it, letting him command me. But because he gives me a choice, he has the power to do it any which way. Because he's the essence of everything. You know, it's funny about the creation. When we look at things that we make as individuals, we make it out of materials that already exist. All this incredible stuff that science is doing, or doctors are doing, or the biologists and the medicine they're doing, is all out of something that already exists. And when you look at the life of Jesus on this earth and how much he was in charge over everything, and he demonstrated he had power over everything. He healed sick. He cast out demons. He had power over absolutely every one of those things. Over nature, which blew the apostles' mind when they're in that boat and Jesus stands up. It didn't dawn on them that Jesus stand and say, all right, y'all, calm down, behave like you should be. Didn't say those words, but, and the world gets calm, and they're all looking at him going, who is this guy? They'd seen him cast out demons. And they're starting to watch this. Of course, it began with changing water into wine, and the miracles just kept growing and kept covering everything out there. But how do you stop nature? And then it dawned on me as I was looking at creation sometime, and God's creative power. Think of it this way if you can. Even the nothing that didn't exist had to bow down to his name. That when he said, let there be light, there wasn't a flashlight that kicked on or a candle to light or a sun to pop out. There was nothing, but even the nothing had to listen to him. And everything else does too. No other gods. There's nothing that is more incredible than God being in your life. Now go back up to chapter 20, verse 2. Something that Alex brought out as we were discussing in the Bible class. But there's a word I intentionally skipped over. In verse 1, it says, I am the Lord, your God, that brought you out of it. And Alex was emphasizing the personal nature, remember Wednesday night, of God. I am not the God. I am the Lord, the God. And he was. But he's looking for a personal connection. And the words that God chooses are just so unique. I'm in awe because most of mine I falter over. And if I ever have a bulletin article that I just sit down and write out, just know that I didn't do that way. Vanessa can contest over how many times I rewrite an article wherever shows up and run it by several other people, including an editor that I find once in a while that helps me. And still, it's not what I want to say exactly, because I can't get the exact words, but God does it. And he does it in such a precise, concise form. I am the Lord your God. You can't get any better than that. Your God. And so he's wanting this because of the personal relationship. So why, it's not just the God, you got to be fearful of him, but I'm your God. I did this for you. And so everything we're doing with our character crisis becomes just a submission to let God be in charge. What was it we mentioned last week? The bumper sticker, was it you, Rush? Somebody said, God is my co-pilot. No, he's your pilot. If you really got it the seats right. There really shouldn't even be a steering wheel in front of us. But don't try it in your vehicle. But out of all of that, we wouldn't have a character crisis. We wouldn't have issues about not having enough police and so many other things. Now, the natural things that happen, they're going to happen. But all these people that are turning our world upside down and either breaking into the Capitol or into cities or into stores and looting and tearing and burning and arguing and fighting and shooting wouldn't exist if God was number one. But it's hard. That's the whole thing. It's hard to give control every day.
God teaches us not in a way that we would want. When we ask for kindness, we are put in positions to where we have to choose to be kind. It's not just given to us. He teaches us that everything is His, and He is the God of all. And it's when you pray for patience, you're going to get a lot of
Problems,
problems that you learn from.
right?
And that is, He's allowing us to choose to learn from or ignore.
Exactly.
So we have to always be focused on the first commandment. He is the God of all. Everything, every molecule, every decision we make, He is the God of that. And if we forget that, that's where we can lose track.
And it's easy to be done, but so true. Final thoughts here on all this. As we're looking at God trying to set the scene for us, but it's easy to get off track. That's 1 minute left, I think, or 5 minutes, whatever. In the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel, very beginnings of the book, there's a woman's name who is Hannah. Hannah is barren, and she wants a child. She wants a child desperately. And she prays and she prays and she prays and prays. And maybe some of you mothers have had to experience that to get your first child. We did for a while. And it's a heartache month after month after month after month of not getting that. And so she goes to the temple and she prays. And she says, Lord, if you'll just give me a son, I'll give him back to you. And if you'll remember the story, after she weans the child, she brings him to the high priest, Eli. And she goes, I'm fulfilling my promise. Now think about it from the boy's perspective. Mom, where are you going? As she walks away. I promised God I was going to leave you here. I don't understand that. Well, what 2 or 3 or 4 years, however old, and they weaned him later in life, but however old he was, would grasp, it's because I promised. And she turns and walks away while the child's crying out. Where are you going, Mom? And she walks away. The Bible does say that she comes back every year with a new cloak. I guess hoping it's the right size, because you're never sure how much a child grows. You know how those things are. But she does that. Now here, Samuel then later is the guy who grows up being under Eli in this area. How he could have written this little story is unique. And this is where I'm after, is how we write what happened to us. My mom deserted me, left me in this whatever place all by myself, did not care. I just had to fend with this old guy named Eli who had older kids that didn't behave, and they did not. I don't care who he was or what he did in life. This is God is mistreating me. Why did this happen? Could have been the way he wrote the story and the way we hear people write. Or I'm just tough enough to do this, and I've grown up even though my mom deserved, in different versions of life. And Eli plants the seed when God's starting to talk to Samuel and God's calling out his name. He says, here's your response. Speak, Lord. Your servant's listening. And that becomes the pattern for Samuel's life. God is number one. And we can get off pattern when we start creating a scenario that God has been misfortune to me and he's done this and he's done that, when really God is guiding us. So the question's not is, God, why are you doing this to me? But more like, wow, God, I wonder what you're up to now. Because you're number one. And with that perspective, we can make a difference in our life and our kids' lives and church and everything else. Okay. Bo, you lead us in a closing prayer. That was the second bell.
Gracious and loving Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time that you've given us today to not only worship you, but to learn more of your word, to fellowship with one another, and to strengthen each other in your earth. Please bless us as we depart from here and help us to be a shining light to those around us, to encourage one another throughout the week, and to bring souls to